Hi, everyone. How are we doing so far? Day 2 of the conference, feeling good? Good. That's not too bad for early morning. I see you've had some coffee. The coffee's been really great. So welcome to this talk about the art and science of SwiftUI animations. Really what we're going to be talking about is understanding animation so we can create better UX. Who here, let me test the clicker. We're good. Who here has used with animation? Most, yes, great. It's our bread and butter. And it's a little bit like when you go to the supermarket and you see all the exciting produce and all the things out there, and you end up cooking the same thing most evenings, most weeks. So what I really want to show you today is some of the cool stuff that got announced at Dubdub last year, really how you can leverage the principles and the theory behind great UI and great animation to make use of some of the really cool stuff that came out, so that at the end, you can put that together and create your own really cool animations. A bit like a chef's omakase. If you're into food, which I am, an omakase is a selection of a carefully selected set of ingredients and dishes that a chef has put together to create something really beautiful, and the sum of it is bigger than its parts. And that's my goal for you today. So what exactly happened at Dubdub? If you'd been following it next to all the buzz of Vision OS, which was obviously the main event of the entire happening, there were actually a lot of cool little things that came out, which are the ingredients that we're going to look at today. So Apple's ended up replacing all the curves that you use by default. Instead, they're using springs now. So everything has a bit more of a bouncy physics-based feel, rather than the standard curves of ease in and out that we've been using for the last 10 to 15 years. You can now also animate your symbols, which is super fun. We finally got a completion handler for with animation, so everyone that's been using that, yes. There's a talk by Zamzam coming later today who's, I think, going to show a little bit of that, which is super cool. But then there were 2 new modifiers. I don't know who's had a chance to play with them, but the phase animator and the keyframe animator came out, and I was especially excited to see those. If you want to go the whole hog, the full way, you can also create your own custom curves right now. That's quite advanced. You have to be really into wanting to tweak your animations to do that, but we have a lot of cool stuff to play with. Now, usually when a selection of this comes out, the first question we ask is how? How can we use all this? But actually, in today's talk, I want to talk about something a little bit different, which is which of these should you use and when? Because we now have a really robust selection, and actually, most of the time when we get stuck writing animations and it's not quite doing what we want or expect it to do, it's because perhaps we're taking an approach for which the tool isn't completely intended to be used. This then helps us also go beyond with animation, or perhaps remove some of the frustration that we've had with it in the past. At least I have had that, especially without that completion handler, because I'm trying to animate something and it isn't quite performing it in the way that I expect to. So to do that, we're going to go back to basics. Or, keeping up with the analogy in cooking, we're going to carefully sort out and organize everything that we know about our animations. We're going to look at great user interfaces, and we're also going to be looking at some of the legends in animation and what we can learn from Disney. Great user interfaces. This in itself could be an entire talk, it could be an entire workshop. But there are 4 key things that I think are very important to remember when you're thinking about a great user interface, which is firstly, is it accessible? I.e., can 100% of the people actually use this interface, which the goal should always be, yes, they can. The next step is intuitive, and intuitive is I find it a great word, but even simpler is it obvious? Because whenever someone wants to do something with your interface, you want it to be as simple and obvious as possible for them to be able to take that step or understand what's going on. Another part of this is actually that when something happens or when they perform an action, the response and the result is in keeping with what their expectations are. If you're unsure of what people's expectations are, Charlene's talk just is a great way to find out. By doing user testing and putting your products in front of people, it's amazing to see how they respond, what they think, and what's actually going on in their minds when they expect things and press buttons and tap around and do all the great things with your apps. The other thing that's quite key is that it's contextual. We only want to be showing things that are necessary and relevant to what's happening at that point in time. We can hide other elements and disclose these progressively as people advance through your user journey or your user interface. An example of this is actually the stock calculator app in iOS. When you have it in vertical, you just use it as an everyday calculator for most of your functions. But if you turn it horizontally, you can actually see cosine, sine, like all the different deep mathematical functions are available to you. It's just hidden away because usually, most of the time, you're not using it. And that is a key example of creating great user interfaces. Now, in order to achieve this then, what's the purpose of animation in relation to what we just spoke about? Because with animation, we think it's for the wow effect, right? It's that extra bit of delight. But when used well, animation can actually reinforce the interface and show users where to go, because the sheer movement draws the user's eye and attention to where it needs to be. And that's exactly how we want to use things. So you can show where items can be found or belong. And so this is a really key part, thinking about transitions. We don't want elements to just disappear or appear out of nowhere. Usually they go a certain place and they come from a certain place. And animation can help us display exactly what that relationship is. Speaking of relationships and a sense of order, that's where it shines as well, where you can say, okay, this is nested within something else. These items are equivalent to each other, and by animating each of those transitions, the logic and the organization behind all elements starts to make sense. You can also show and hide those additional elements based on context and function. Just as I mentioned about the calculator earlier, you can actually add more things to your iMessage, in this particular case that you're seeing. But it's carefully hidden away, and by the swipe gesture that's happening and the motion of pushing items up and pulling them down, you can see what the order and the nested structure of everything is, again adding to the coherence of the interface. Lastly, it can also give feedback on the user's behavior and input, so that they understand whatever they did worked or didn't work in relation to what's going on. A clear example is when you put a wrong passcode in or when it doesn't recognize your face. And so you see the dynamic island is shaking no at the top. And then equally, if you put in the wrong passcode, it says, nope, it's not working, in a very recognizable way where it's shaking from left to right. That being said, delight is also a factor. However, animation can do so much more. So when we think about our basic with animation function, why does it fall short from time to time when we're trying to achieve all the things that we just looked at in terms of animating with SwiftUI? Typically speaking, it's because there is a sequence of animations happening to best explain the logic that's going on in the interface. So in here, for example, this is the thing I use all day, every day, and it's one of my favorite animations in iOS, is when I'm trying to access a certain app, I just search for it. And by pulling down, a couple things are happening here. Firstly, the background, the selection of apps in the library, is fading away. But it's not just fading away, it's shrinking and it's blurring. It now shows that it's a layer underneath what you're about to do, but it hasn't completely disappeared. So you're still aware of the context of what you're doing, but you're getting a new user interface presented to you with which you can go and discover whatever app you want to find. The second small but key difference is that the text field of app library is now being left aligned if you are Latin speaking and you read or write left to right. And it's activated. And so in order to get from center to left, an animation has to take place, but you want it to be subtle enough that it's not suddenly jolting, but you also want it to be obvious enough so the attention is drawn there and the user knows that's the next step to take. So if we then want to be creative with this and start to replicate this and build this, we have to break it down in order to be able to develop it. And so the question then becomes, how do we break it down? What actually is animation? Because if we understand that, then we know all the steps to take and everything to program in order to replicate it. So, animation at its core is replicating movement that we experience, see, and feel in everyday life. And one of the best ways to see that is, I think, by looking at dance. dance is a beautiful form in which people are able to express movement in the most creative ways. And we are going to give it a go today. So you don't have to jump like this. Don't worry at all. But I am going to ask you to please stand up. The maximum amount of moving you're going to have to do is bounce and maybe raise your hands. So if people are up for it, I'm going to ask you and invite you to please stand up. All right, I'm going to play some music and I'm going to give you some instructions. Okay. Can we turn it down? I'm trying to turn it down a little, or should I just keep it up? It's not listening to my volume. Is it okay? Okay, cool. We're going to go for it. So, in a moment the beat will start and I'm going to ask you to just bend your knees to the timing of the beat. Just like this, that's all. And I want you to notice what else is moving. What do you have to do in order to move your knees? Okay, I'm going to pause it. Please keep standing. I'm going to do one more bit. But I don't know if you notice, but in order to move your knees, you actually have to move a lot more about your body. So I want you to pay attention to your feet. What are your feet doing? What are your hips doing? Because it's very hard, actually, to move one part in isolation alone. The next exercise, and I'm going to play it again. I don't know if you heard towards the end, there was a bit where they go, aha. And at that part, we're going to raise our hands and drop it down. So it goes like, aha. Okay? And after that, you're done. Don't worry. I'll talk you through it. So we're going to be bouncing again for the first bit. And again, pay attention to the rest of your body in order to bounce your knees. Notice your feet. Notice your hips. And also start thinking about timing. And now the aha is going to come. East Africa, Addis Ababa, have the same vision. All right, good job, everyone. Give yourself a round of applause. Thank you for humoring me. You were probably wondering, why did she make us do that? Especially it's 10 a.m. We've not had enough coffee for this. I thought karaoke was tonight. There is a reason. And I'm going to explain it as we look at the next slide. So when the aha was happening, if you want to match your hands to that specific moment in time, you have to actually start thinking about it before. Because if you do it at the moment where it's relevant, it's too late. Which shows the animation timing that is so, the art of timing that's so important in movement. And you see the same in dancing. Did it not play? Okay, perfect. The next thing is how much more of our bodies are moving when we're trying to make a particular movement. And here as well, when they jump up, they have to go down in order to go up. And I'm hoping that you were able to notice this as you were bouncing yourself as well. You have to push the floor away in order to actually move your knees. So we're thinking we're moving this element over here, but we're actually controlling and thinking about, even if it's subconsciously, so many more elements in our body. So some of these observations are, in order to go up, we have to go down to give us that lift. In order to go big, we have to contract and be small in order to grow. And in order to go forward, you actually have to take a step back to launch yourself forward. Meaning that in order to perform a movement, you have to launch into it, do the movement, and then exit it, because that's exactly how physics works. And it's no different with animation. So if we're trying to recreate great animation, these are really key concepts to think about. We see the same in animation. So in here you see Ariel, she looks down and moves down before she actually swims up. Same here, in order to move, you see the head, it goes back, it goes forward, the arms go small, they go big. It's all about the contrast to actually focus on a particular key element of the animation. And here Bambi also goes down before they jump up. Now, thankfully, we don't have to figure this out from scratch because there are existing principles. Yay! And in this case, we are now honing our technique. So it's a bit like chopping lots and lots of onions until you get it right when you're thinking about cooking. We're going to do the same for animation. There are 12 key principles for animation, as written in the 70s when they started to document this at Disney Animation. You will actually find that a lot of the things we're going to look at today are built into things like After Effects and the Adobe Suite, but actually also into all of the animation tools we use in Swift, SwiftUI, but even before that in Objective-C. So, starting with squash and stretch. All of these beautiful diagrams, by the way, are created by Sento Loggiani, and I just want to credit that because I think they're beautiful examples of each of these principles. So in the pull-down animation, when we were looking earlier at searching for our app library, certain elements are contracting to give way to other elements. And there is a level of weight to the cube as he bounces up and down, because by squashing and stretching, you're actually denoting the real movement that's happening. If a block were to fall and hit the ground with physics, it wouldn't just land. Other things would be happening. And so this is one thing to think about when you're trying to put together your animation. Anticipation is also a key part, right? And this is what I hope you were able to feel when you were thinking about moving your arms. You have to actually think about that before you go and do it. You see this in iOS as well. The dynamic island is a great example. It kind of jiggles and it grows and shrinks before the actual thing happens that it's trying to interact with. When you get a phone call, when you dismiss your music, the level of jiggle that happens shows you that that's actually where an action is about to go and occur. Similarly, staging is the principle where you try and highlight what's most important about what's about to happen. So, these are visual cues that you can add that helps to draw your eye to where it matters. So when we're thinking about, for example, those extra things that you could do in iMessage, where you can leave a voice note, you can attach a photo, there's a level of visual difference that tends to happen. It blurs the background, it creates a circle around it. All of these little elements help you stage what's about to occur. There's also the principle then of follow-through and overlapping action. In animation, what that means is rarely does something come to standstill straight away, right? It kind of shoots over. When we look at animation curves, if you've actually had a look at the new ones that have been released with springs, you see it actually jumps over a bit before it comes to standstill. Especially when you're playing with bouncy animations, you will have seen the leftover jiggle that tends to happen. That is this principle in action. The pull-down action of the search of the app library, again, is a great example where you can see this because there's a sequence of things that occurs, and by the end, the blur and other things that happen, they are a result, they are a result of what happened of your initial input. Now, slow in, slow out, we might better know as ease in, ease out. So this idea has been around for decades, and it's why it was the fundamental spring or curve that we've been using all this time. Similarly, it's the same in video, it's the same in Keynote, it's the same in After Effects, it's the same in kind of any movement-based program or interface that you're using. It's something that comes back because we don't move in linear fashion. Oftentimes, just because of the physics and the resistance in everyday life on planet Earth and gravity, we can't launch into our top speed straight away. We have an acceleration and a deceleration. And this is why when you're using a linear curve in animation, sometimes it can feel a bit off. There's a time and a place, right? Sometimes for progress bars, charts, or loops, it's helpful to have a linear curve, especially with a loop, because otherwise you can tell it's a loop because it's behaving a bit differently. But most of the time, you want to pick a much more natural spring. Very closely related is timing. Timing is probably the key part that if you get it wrong in animation, it will basically destroy the entire thing because it can either feel too slow or too fast. And that's an issue for two reasons. When it's slow, it's laggy. But when it's fast, Something's moved in the corner of your eye. You haven't had the chance to actually really observe or absorb what happened there, and it leaves people with a sense of unease and confusion. So getting the timing right is key. And actually, this way, animations can make your UI feel even more responsive. Notice how, if you see them both, one of them feels like it lags, even though they start and end at the same time. So the total duration is the same, but the feeling of both of them is completely different. The bottom one feels more responsive and feels more natural to use. The next principle is that of the arc, and actually using much more bendy and circular feeling motions. This is one that's a bit harder to think about when you're translating it to UX, but I think actually one system that does it really well is Google's Material. So if you're thinking of using something like Google Translate, or you're trying to tap the microphone, the circle will grow in and out in a particular way. They're really making use of this arc feeling. But that's perhaps a bit more of a niche one in the list. Secondary action is one of my favorites, and actually one that's often overlooked in UI. It's where other elements move as a result of the primary element moving, right? And this is what you saw earlier with the search bar. There are small things happening there as a result of that search bar becoming activated. So it means we have to move the little icon, it means we have to change the text alignment, it means we have to change the cursor. All of these secondary actions are really important in making it feel natural. When I did an animation workshop 6 months ago, one person in the audience worked for a shopping app. And what he ended up making was so cool. So when you put an item in your basket, he animated the item going into the shopping basket icon. But he then got the basket to jiggle at the end, purely from the physics of like something being dropped in the basket. And it completely changed the way that felt. And so I ask you, think about the secondary actions that are taking place when you're trying to animate. Exaggeration is one that happens a lot more in what I would consider, Disney-type animation than probably what we use day to day. But still, you can see it in the movements of the dynamic island and the way it bounces. For example, when you dismiss your music and it swipes up into it, the entire island is bouncy and jiggly as a result. And so there are still ways to adopt this in the context of UI and UX as well. Solid drawing is more about the visual part. So this is the part where you're probably going to work a bit more with your visual designer on adopting it. But we see it in terms of transparency and blur. So having lots of layers to give it depth is the way that we do that in iOS is much more based on transparency than it is on 3D or skeuomorphism, which is, ancient at this point. But there are ways to still show depth and the context of depth to our users. And then lastly, appeal. Visual delight. Delight still very much has a role to play. As Charlene said earlier, there is a difference between drinking water and drinking bubble tea. Now, no one does that better than Not Boring Apps. I don't know if anyone's used these suites. It's made by some of the creators of Paper by 53 originally. And there are a lot of funny things happening here, where when you move the numbers, the drop shadow changes, or the background color changes, or there's little sparks when you're calculating things. They've taken very typical everyday apps and given them that concept of appeal and that concept of delight. Now there's one that I didn't talk about yet, and normally this one pops up a lot earlier, and that is straight ahead action and pose to pose. These are two techniques that animators used originally when they were drawing all the characters out for every single frame in the image to denote how these characters were moving through time. And so pose to pose will literally have you go from one pose to another pose to another pose again. And it will interpolate in between what's happening. Straight ahead allows you to actually draw or denote every stage of the movement in case you want to make other changes. It's considered more technically complex, but a lot more unique and natural depending on what visual effect you're trying to create. Now, if anyone's already used the modifiers released in iOS 17, this might look familiar to you. because that's exactly what the phase animator and the keyframe animator are for. So, when all elements move, I would say, on the same beat, meaning that they are in sync, not every element has to move at each step, so things can skip a step, but they are moving effectively from one pose or phase to the next, to the next. That's when you choose to use the phase animator. Instead, when there are elements that have their own individual timings that are not in sync, for example, I could be walking, but I could be like moving my hands completely independently of my feet, right? Then you would use something like the keyframe animator. The keyframe animator allows you to create a track, if you will, a timeline, for each element that you're trying to animate, and you can choose exactly what will happen when. Whereas when you're working with the phase animator, you denote different stages, and you just tell the elements what will happen to them in the process of every single stage. Like I said, you can skip a stage. You know, one element can choose to not do something, but it can't do anything out of sync compared to all the other phases. So, with that, when we look back at what got released at Dubdub 23, and we look back at the list of ingredients that we have available to us, it really was a great year for animations, because now we finally have a really complete set to play with in order to actually encapsulate all of those animation principles so we can make even better UX. You now effectively have all the tools to do this. When I started, I said, rather than talking about how, I want to give you a recipe for when to use things and which to pick. And so questions you want to be asking yourself in terms of a little checklist are as follows. What's the purpose of this animation? And how can this animation reinforce the UX or the experience that people are going through? Which elements should be animating? And would it be more than the obvious ones? Are there other elements affected by what is currently being animated? Do I need to signal what's about to happen? Do I need to highlight something? Do I need to draw the user's attention anywhere before the actual animation or action takes place? Equally, is there anywhere it needs to land at the end? If they've completed a certain action, where are they likely to go next? And can I bring that into the animation, or should I? In what order does everything animate? And are these in sync? Am I using the right curve, and does it feel natural? And lastly, but most importantly, is the timing right? And really play around with that. Go with all the extremes to go and find that sweet spot. Now, this list looks very simple, but I promise you, if you follow it, you will actually avoid about 90% of the bugs that you will find yourself in when you are working with animations. Because most of the time, it's because we actually aren't completely clear on which elements we're animating, what we're trying to achieve with it, how to break down that animation, and therefore what tools or API we're applying in order to achieve that. However, at the end, the recipe, it's yours to make, right? You have the ability to transform something that's actually otherwise really functional into something magical, and with that, create your own omakase, or your own chef's dish. So I hope you had some fun. Thank you for bouncing along, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks a lot, Maxim. That was a very interactive presentation. Thank you so much. I love this kind of stuff. Like, animation is like the stuff that got me into iOS. Like the sort of like fluid design you can do on iOS is something that doesn't really translate to macOS. Like, it's a very unique thing that iOS does really well, and I love doing it. It's so much fun every day. So thank you so much for that talk. That was fantastic.
You're very welcome.
We have time for one or two questions. Are there any questions? Everyone's so amazed at this one. Of Amy, of course.
Yeah, love the talk. One of the things I always struggle with is identifying those secondary sort of animations that really make it sort of, to use an overloaded term, pop or delight and stuff like that. What are some tips to, like, just understand that better, identify them, and just be a bit better in picking up what's required?
Absolutely. So usually what I work with is it's kind of that point of where do they start, where's their eye initially, and where do they end in terms of what are they trying to do next, and the trajectory of the animation. So for example, say you press a button and something pops up. So we might be thinking, okay, they've pressed the button, we're going to focus on the pop-up. That's the main element that's animating. But as we know, typically speaking, when you press a button, there's a bit of feedback there as well. So it's looking at all the elements that are involved, and in the vicinity, if there's anything else that needs to respond. So thinking about the button, we might actually have a touchdown state, even though they took out touch up inside and a couple of things in SwiftUI, to my sadness. If you have a certain background, I'm coming up with something on the fly now, you could have a ripple effect. So if you had like a fluid background, you could press that button and it could actually spread out a little or do something to the things around it. Now, if this is a button you're pressing all the time and it's in a bit more of a utility-based app, it might go a bit against the design principles of the app and it might feel a bit out of place. But if it's a very fun, fluid, jolly type of app, it might suit really well. And so to answer your question succinctly, it's looking at the layers, the actual visual elements and layers that are before, during, and after the main thing that we're trying to animate. So dismissing the pop-up, the other elements might come back, and if you really want to focus in the center of the screen, or they've just written something, or they've confirmed something, that would be the next step. And so that next final thing, say a confirmation little banner at the top, that might be the other thing we want to animate, because that's now the result of what just took place. Sorry if that was a long answer, but
That was a good answer. Thank you.
I'm glad.
Awesome. I think